On the evening of July 30th, 2008, Tim McLean, a 22-year-old carnival worker, was returning home to Winnipeg riding Greyhound bus 1170 when he was violently stabbed, beheaded and cannibalized by another passenger, Vince Lee, about 18 kilometers west of Portage la Prairie, Manitoba. After the police arrived on the scene, RCMP watched for hours as the offender, Vincent Lee, age 40, defiled Tim's body inside the bus after the driver and remaining passengers had fled, powerless to stop the man's attack. Less than 1 year later, Vince Lee would be found NCR for Tim McLean's murder. And NCR stands for Not Criminally Responsible, which is basically Canada's version of not guilty by reason of insanity. He was then held in a Manitoba psychiatric hospital, from which he would be released only 6 years later. Tim McLean, Jr. was born October 3, 1985, in Victoria General Hospital, just outside of Winnipeg. He grew up just outside Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, in a small town called Ely, which has a population of about 650 people. Tim was a very active person who loved soccer, football, motorbiking, and generally anything that would get him into dirt or trouble. He was the type of person who could bring out the best in people with his charm and never got tired of pulling pranks. He had an outgoing personality and loved people. He was also a fan of the Insane Clown Posse, who are both a rap duo and a wrestling pair. He had a close relationship with his father and brother, and was from a huge family who he loved and valued very much. His uncle Alex would later say in an interview, quote, "Tim was a stubborn soul and a kind one. He made friends effortlessly, disliked no one, and accepted everyone for who they were. He was a charmer who loved to smile, and you could never take a plate of food away from him," his friends would say. He was always a really happy and pleasant person to be around. He absolutely loved life and lived life to the fullest. Tim loved to travel, seeing new places and meeting new people. So much so that he took a job as a carnival worker after he took a gig at the Red River exhibition in Winnipeg in the years before his death. And right from the start, Tim loved working at the carnival. It gave him the freedom to explore Canada and to be around all different types of people. Tim found that his talent for talking came in handy when he ran the games on the Midway as a carnival barker. He was good at his job because he was so outgoing and super talkative. He typically would run the Midway games by attracting in people with his outgoing and fun-loving personality. He also got along with his carnival co-workers, and when the night was over, they all hung out and he was always a part of the group. Tim overall loved the carnival life. It was just basically one big family that traveled from place to place. Throughout his travels with the carnival, Tim would fall in love with British Columbia. He decided he wanted to plant his roots down somewhere in BC, but quite possibly Vancouver Island. So by the end of July 2008, Tim decided that he did not want to go to the next stop with the traveling carnival inn. Instead, he would be going back to British Columbia to work at the PE, which stands for the Pacific National Exhibition. The PE is a national event. It's actually pretty big. It includes Midway games, carnival trade shows, that sort of thing. And it's something that everyone looks forward to before school begins again in September. Before going to the PE, Tim wanted to return home to Winnipeg to visit family and relax, because after the PE, when it was over, he would most likely be off on a new adventure. After a successful but exhausting trip to Edmonton's Capitol Exhibition, Tim McLean was on his way back to Winnipeg to see his family. When people learned he was returning home to Winnipeg, his friends offered to buy him a plane ticket, but Tim declined the offer and instead decided to take the Greyhound bus from Edmonton to Winnipeg. He didn't mind taking the Greyhound. There was a lot of scenery to look at, and he could relax and enjoy the trip. At approximately 12:30 a.m., on July 30th, Tim McLean boarded Greyhound bus 1170 in Edmonton, Alberta, to start his journey back home. He was planning to use this time alone on the ride to chill out, listen to music, text with his friends, and nap. The bus ride, for the most part, was completely uneventful, until a passenger named Vince Lee boarded that Greyhound on July 30th, 2008 in Erickson, Manitoba, at 5:55 p.m. Vincent Wegwin Lee was born April 30th, 1969, in Dingdong City, China, which is close to the North Korean border. His father would later say he was born 1 month premature, but due to healthcare in China, he wasn't incubated and just sent home from the hospital. This resulted in Vince being sickly as a baby. He had numerous medical issues related to his lungs that went on into his teenage years. It was also said that because of these medical conditions, his family favored him and he was spoiled. Other than the medical issues, he had a fairly normal childhood. He was often 1 to 2 years behind many developmental milestones. But despite these struggles, he did well in school. Vince attended the University of Wuhan Institute of Technology, from which he graduated with an engineering degree in applied electronics and computer engineering in 1992. He would eventually get a job in his chosen field in a factory in Beijing and would meet his wife there and get married in 1995. When they were living in China, their life was simple and Vince seemed normal and happy. Friends of the family would later say that it didn't appear that Lee was struggling with any type of mental illness. He wasn't violent, he didn't do drugs and didn't drink excessively. In 2001, Vince and his wife would immigrate from China to Winnipeg, Canada. Toronto was really their first choice, but they eventually settled on Winnipeg. The cost of living there was much lower, and they didn't have a lot of money, so their modest savings would go much further in a smaller city. As what often happens with a lot of new immigrants, Vince struggled to find employment. Even though Vince had a college degree, he would end up working in the kitchen area at McDonald's for a little while. His English at the time wasn't strong and not good enough to serve customers. Although he was frustrated and employed far below his capabilities, Vince was persistent and hardworking. Vince's wife would also work at a local Thai restaurant, and because Vince wasn't happy working at McDonald's, he was able to return to school, going to CDI College, where he completed a computer program, Ming Diploma, in 2002 that paired well with the degree he already had. He was hoping this would help him get a job more aligned with his skills. Unfortunately, these hopes faded when all he could get were low-paying labor gigs, and eventually he ended up taking a job at Tim Hortons in the kitchen area. A few years later, around 2004, Vince and his wife started to argue a lot, and this was also around the time that things started going badly for Vince, mental health-wise. It was around this time. Vince would later admit that he started hearing voices, and he would also have strange and distressing thoughts. There was a voice he was hearing that was apparently coming from the sun, telling him that he was the Chinese Jesus. According to Jeffrey Waldman in the book Shrunk, quote, whenever he made decisions at the time, he would walk outside and stare at the sun to wait for instructions about what to do. Vince would eventually tell his wife about these voices, and that he actually saw God. His wife just thought that he was tired, so she bought him some sleeping pills, thinking that all he needed was a good night's sleep. After some time passed, the voices were only getting more frequent and giving him more direction, which was extremely alarming to people who knew him. Some of his friends and his wife were now pushing him to go see a doctor, but Vince refused to do so as he didn't really trust Western medicine. The constant arguing and stress caused Vince and his wife to separate in 2005, and in September 2005, the voice from the sun that Vince perceived to be God directed Vince to get on a Greyhound bus to go see a friend who lived in Toronto. But once he arrived, he realized that he didn't know where his friend lived. Over the next few days, he wandered around the city looking for his friend, talking to strangers and spending what little money he had. Then, out of nowhere, the voice from the sun directed him to go back to Winnipeg. So he started to walk down the highway, which is totally normal, where, in a completely agitated and confused state, he was picked up by the police and taken to a hospital in Etobicoke and held there on a psychiatric halt. Vince seemed very disorientated. He was acting like he hadn't really slept or ate for days, and the doctors would diagnose Vince as being in a schizophrenic catatonic state. They kept him there for 10 days and gave him medicine to try and help him out. During his stay at the hospital, he was given antipsychotic medication, antidepressant medication, and mood stabilizers. Vince apparently doesn't have very many memories of his stay at the Etobicoke hospital. At the time, he believed he was being punished for something and left the hospital against medical advice. He also left without medication and had to contact his frustrated wife, who helped him get back to Winnipeg. When he returned home to Winnipeg, he would eventually file for divorce from his wife and return to China and live there for a short while. And his father would also remember that Vince seemed irritated, bull, and was unable to hold down a job in China either. And then at some point, Vince would eventually reunite with his wife and move back to Canada. They settled in Edmonton, Alberta, where he would take a job at Walmart and also delivered newspapers. They also attended church on a regular basis. And then in 2007, Vince Lee would receive his Canadian citizenship. And while it sounds like everything is better and Vince is coping, he really wasn't. For 3 years, Vince Lee was receiving messages from God through the sun, and no one else suspected or had a clue that he was receiving these messages. The people that knew him suspected that he might have some sort of mental problem, but it wasn't in his personality to be violent. He had no history of drug or alcohol abuse, and he was never diagnosed with a personality disorder. However, the voice from God, now talking to him, relentlessly told Vince that he needed to start carrying a knife, which he did. Around 2008, people in his life started to notice his behavior changes, and he was becoming very erratic. Either his moods would be off, or he wouldn't be able to have a normal conversation with somebody, or he would often randomly blurt things out that were completely out of context to the topic they were discussing. Vince would eventually be fired from his Walmart job after an argument with a coworker, and he would leave his wife again, not telling her why or even where he was going. At the end of July 2008, the voice from God told Vince that he needed to start traveling again. I don't know why I keep pointing up. I just assume God is above me. He delivered his last batch of newspapers on the morning of July 2008, and then purchased a Greyhound bus ticket to go to Winnipeg. He was traveling under the alias Wong Pent. Before Lee got on the bus, he sent a note to his ex-wife, and it read, quote, "I'm gone. Don't go looking for me. I wish you were happy." Even though his ticket was for Winnipeg, Manitoba, Vince Lee got off the bus with his 3 bags in Erickson, Manitoba. I felt just my stomach turning, and I knew that there was something about this guy when I saw him. I just knew. Witnesses later said that there didn't appear to be any conversation between Tim and Vince. Tim was a laid-back person and didn't appear to be bothered by Vince sitting there. Tim would then close his eyes, rest his head against the window, and drift off to sleep while listening to music with his headphones on. And Vince Lee just sat there staring ahead, acting strangely. Witnesses would later say that he had a 2-liter bottle of iced tea and a roll of toilet paper that he would tuck under his chin like this while he drank from the iced tea bottle. Steve, who was beside Vince on the opposite side of the aisle, said that Vince started rocking himself back and forth and chanting something that sounded like Chinese. Steve remembers that it made him very nervous, but he just sat there quietly with his wife because he didn't want to attract any attention to himself. There was a fear of him or his wife getting hurt. Only about 5 minutes later, at 8:35 p.m., God told Vince to kill Tim and eliminate the force of evil. And Steve would watch in horror as Vince took a large hunting knife out of his bag and turned towards Tim. Quote, "I saw him take out the knife. I guess that had been the point where he snapped and just went crazy, looking at a crazy man in sunglasses with an unsheathed knife staring right at you. So I was like, great, I'm going to die." Steve Allison watched in horror as Vince Lee turned to his right and attacked Tim McLean. A quote from the Tim's Law website at approximately 8:30 p.m. On Wednesday, July 30th, 2008, when Greyhound bus 1170 was approximately 18 kilometers west of Portage la Prairie on the Trans-Canada Highway, Vince Lee began to repeat, "Stabbed Tim McLean for no apparent reason." Vince would later say that while he was stabbing Tim, he was simply doing everyone a service by taking action and listening to these voices. Steve Allison started yelling, stopping the bus. "Someone's getting stabbed," he said. The minute he turned, I stood up and ran down the aisle. Passenger Garnet Katoen, who was a 26-year-old seismic driller and who had also been sitting in the row in front of Tim McLean and Vince Lee, shared his memories of what happened. Later, in an interview given to the Canadian press, he said, "I heard this blood-curdling scream, and I turned around and the guy sitting behind me was standing up and stabbing another guy with a big Rambo knife right in the throat repeatedly, like 40 or 50 times. And when he was attacking him, he was calm. It was like he was at the beach. There was no rage or anything. He was just like a robot stabbing the guy." Witnesses would describe the screams of Tim as being haunting and something they will never forget. And the passengers, who were close enough to see what was happening, would describe Vince as emotionless. Steve would say that it felt like that the stabbing didn't stop. Quote, "Everything was chaos. People were crying, people were sick." And he would do his best to assist his wife and other passengers to get off the bus safely. Tim McLean would end up on the floor of the bus, with Vince Lee slashing and stabbing him repeatedly. Defensive wounds on Tim's body indicate that he put up his hands and arms to protect himself and tried to get away. But Lee's attack was brutal and relentless. When the bus did pull over, the passengers and the driver would flee from the bus and away from Vince. And Vince didn't even seem to notice the chaos of the passengers leaving. He was just in his own little world stabbing Tim. A quote from the Tim's Law website, "Mr. Lee was preoccupied with Tim McLean and continued to stab him as he lay on the floor. He did not pay any attention to the other passengers. As the bus was vacated, he appeared oblivious to the demands of the bus driver, Bruce Martin, that he stop what he was doing. Garden Ketton Bruce Martin and a few other passengers returned to the bus to try to stop Vince Lee. Chris Aguirre was a truck driver and saw the Greyhound bus pulled over with the passengers on the side of the highway. He stopped to see if they needed help, and a woman screamed that somebody was being stabbed, so he would radio in for help. Chris and another man armed themselves with a metal bar from his truck. They tried to get back into the bus to see if they could do anything to help Tim and to stop Vince from whatever he was doing. Chris would also describe Vince as emotionless. Vince wouldn't say a word to either of the men. Instead, he would robotically lean over Tim's body and begin beheading him with his knife. When Chris and the other man yelled for Vince to stop, Vince would chase them out with his knife in one hand, and according to Chris, Tim's head was in the other. And witnesses would say that Vince would walk right up to the door, hold up Tim's head, and show the passengers what he had done. A quote from the Canadian press, he walked back to his seat and brought the head to the front and pretty much displayed it to us like that, and then dropped it on the ground in front of us. Knowing that they were unable to help Tim McLean and fearing for their own lives, Bruce Martin and his passengers decided it was best if they barricaded the bus door. According to Tim McLean, the bus driver was able to close the door on Mr. Lee's arm with the bloody knife extended on the outside of the bus. Mr. Lee was able to pull his arm back into the bus and return to the rear of the bus, where he defiled the body of Tim McLean. Mr. Martin immediately called 911 once everyone was off safely and the bus door was closed. Also, a quick-thinking Bruce Martin was able to disable the bus from the outside, so Vince Lee would not be able to drive away with it. The driver of another Greyhound who arrived on the scene later cut all power to the bus, and while this was happening, Vince Lee continued to mutilate Tim McLean. Vince would then walk up and down the aisle, showing Tim's head, further terrifying the passengers, and then he would go back and mutilate Tim's body some more. All of this was being done apparently because of the word of God. Vince was trying to stop evil forces and thought this is what he had to do. When the RCMP finally arrived, they had no idea what they were going to encounter and made the controversial decision not to enter the bus for their own safety and the safety of Vince Lee, who was apparently speaking gibberish and clearly suffering from a psychotic break. However, they did provide a running radio commentary of what Lee was doing. His nickname throughout this commentary was Badger. Evidently, the strategy for the RCMP was just to wait him out for 4 hours. A group of men were guarding the door to the buses with crowbars and hammers, really any sort of equipment they could think to use as a weapon, and Vince was still pacing the bus armed with his knife. Meanwhile, the police continued to attempt communication with Lee for the duration of this. But due to Vince Lee's mental state, meaningful dialogue was completely impossible. The RCMP even called in special negotiators because in their mind, there was no way to get Vince Lee off the bus, and he wasn't communicating with anybody. He would occasionally stop pacing up and down the bus, but would continue to cut up and cannibalize Tim's body for more than 4 hours. Vince Lee was inside bus 1170 with Tim McLean's body, during which time he further mutilated and reportedly ate a portion of Tim, including his eyes and a part of his heart. Although Vince Lee still had eyes that he ate parts of Tim, passengers and witnesses didn't understand why police allowed this to go on for so long. A quote from Chris Aguirre, the truck driver who stopped to help out. "I'm pretty sure our SWAT teams have tear gas things that take out windows or some sort of gas to knock him out. I'm sure they could have pumped enough in there to ensure that he was knocked out. They would have stopped a lot, I'm sure of it. But police didn't try to shoot Vince or use gas on the bus either. They just decided to wait it out and try and reason with Vince. But Vince wasn't being reasonable. Instead, he was doing unthinkable things to Tim's body. The inaction of the RCMP is difficult for most people to understand, even till this day. Finally, after almost 5 hours, Vince would try to escape out of a back window at the back of the bus. And that morning, the forensic unit found parts of Tim McLean scattered all over the bus. A quote from Tim McLean at approximately 120 on the July 31st, Mr. Lee broke open a window on the bus, threw out some personal belongings, a knife and a pair of scissors. He then jumped out of the bus, head first landing on top of the knife. An RCMP member immediately tried to apprehend him. He was struggling, screaming, and refused to surrender his hands. Police stunned him with a taser on several occasions. But before he surrendered his hands and could be handcuffed and taken to a police vehicle, Found in Mr. Lee's pocket was a plastic bag containing Tim McLean's nose, ear, and tongue. Mr. Lee was then formally arrested. Tim's body was then recovered from the bus and taken for autopsy. His body showed evidence of damage in excess of 100 area US, ranging from abrasions to a large gaping wound in his chest. News reports of the violent graphic incident went viral only a day afterwards. It seemed like everybody knew of the killing. Tim's eyes and a part of his heart were never recovered. Carol Dedeli, Tim's mother, has no doubt who was responsible for some of the actions that occurred that night. She feels that the RCMP officers who rushed to the scene and waited and watched share some of the blame. I understand that they have a preservation of life policy, and clearly my son's life was not able to be preserved and was already gone. But how do you sit and watch what he's doing? This individual ate my child's eyes, a third of his heart, and they allowed that to continue. And I'm supposed to be okay with that? I'm not okay with that. Having lost him the way I lost him was horrific enough. But knowing that nobody even tried by now, news of the attack had spread worldwide, and one group in particular thought it would be a good idea to use this as their political statement. After the stabbing incident, PETA got involved. They thought it would be a good idea to send an advertisement to the Portage Daily Graphic comparing the murder of Tim McLean to the killing of animals for food. What a bunch of fucking assholes. Fortunately, the paper did not allow the ad to run, but the fact that it even tried to submit it in the first place. PETA was harshly criticized for attempting to exploit the incident in such a matter, but refused to apologize. Also, the week after the attack took place, Greyhound Canada announced it was pulling a series of nationwide ads that included the line, quote, "There's a reason you never heard of bus rage." But of course, at that point, everyone had heard of bus rage. Also making an appearance in this story was the Westboro Baptist Church. The daughter of the founder of the Westboro Baptist Church, which is based in Topeka, Kansas, told CTV News that she and other church members planned to go to Winnipeg to demonstrate against what she described as McLean's quite filthy way of life. Shirley Phelps Roper said that Tim's life was a symbol of Canada's moral decay. She also said that his brutal murder was a sign from God. Quote, "You gotta connect the dots, people, from your idols to your filthy way of life. Here's what I know, he's dead. And God does not do that to people who serve in his truth." Canadian border guards were under strict orders to try and prevent members of the Westboro Baptist Church from entering the country. Shirley Phelps Roper, the daughter of church founder Fred Phelps, said that a group of church members were turned away from a border crossing at Niagara Falls, but a small group did manage to get into Manitoba. However, the Westboro Baptist Church did not follow through with their protest. And even if they did, they wouldn't have gotten anywhere close to the church. A counter-protest of about 400 people that was organized on Facebook arrived on the day of Tim McLean's funeral. The plan was for a human chain to be formed, to block access to the church and cemetery without verbally or physically interacting with the Westboro Baptist Church. Now the officers not only had to deal with Vince, but they needed to deal with the scene of the crime. Dr. Stanley Yarin met with Vince, and at this point, he really wasn't able to speak much because he was heavily medicated. Dr. Yarin gave Vince a pad of paper and a pencil, and Vince would write on this, quote, "God will kill me." So to Dr. Yarin, it was clear that Vince Lee was deep into the thick of his mental illness. Every single person who knew Tim was horrified and deeply saddened by what happened to him. His community and family were in complete shock. The violence was so unspeakable. And a makeshift tribute was set up by Tim's family and friends at the spot on the highway where Tim had died. It was there where people went to grieve for the young man who had been taken from them so suddenly and in such a brutal way. They brought flowers and ribbons and other tributes, as well as writing notes and poems of love to Tim on the crosses there. And there were dozens of internet tributes as well. Vince Lee would officially be charged with second-degree murder in Tim McLean's death and sent for a psychiatric evaluation. But Lee was refusing to assist with his legal representation. And when it was time for Vince to appear in court, he had decided not to hire a lawyer. His only words at his court appearance on August 5, 2008 were, quote, "Please kill me." Vince Lee's trial began on March 9, 2009, and he had representation that said Vince couldn't be held accountable for what he did because he had untreated schizophrenia. During the trial, people would learn that Vince actually tried to kill a man the day before he killed Tim. Vince was at the bus station and saw a man driving around, and God told Vince that this man had come to kill him. So Vince pulled out his knife, but fortunately, Vince would also say that he was supposed to stay in Erickson to live forever by the word of God. But Vince had disobeyed God's orders when he boarded the bus that day. So God was angry and told him that Tim was going to kill him. So in his mind, it was partially self-defense and partially removing evil from the world. Vince truly believed that God wanted him to kill Tim and mutilate his body to prevent him from resurrecting from the dead. I feel ridiculous even telling this story. And he was apparently hearing voices from all sorts of gods, good gods, evil gods. And he could never keep the voices straight. And these voices were just tearing him apart. In his mind, it got to the point where he needed to kill or be killed. And after only 3 days of testimony, Vincent Lee was found not criminally responsible for the death of Tim McLean. In his decision, Justice John Schofield said, "These grotesque acts are appalling. However, the acts themselves and the context in which they were committed are strongly suggested to be a mental disorder." He did not appreciate the actions he committed were morally wrong. He believed he was acting in self-defense. Vince Lee, who claimed he was mutilating Tim to prevent him from resurrecting from the dead, would be on his way to a hospital bed, not a prison cell. And Tim's friends and family were appalled. They felt that Vince should be locked up forever, and the key to his cell should be thrown away. Some people even believed that he was faking his symptoms and knew full well what he was doing. According to Winnipeg Free Press reporter Mike McIntyre, Carol Dodeli had a lot to say outside the courtroom after this ruling. "He still did it," she said. "Whether he was in his right frame of mind or not, he still did the act. There is nobody else on that bus holding a knife and slicing up my child. Nobody else did that. Just one individual did that." Dodeli said the law needs to be changed so someone could be found not psychologically accountable, but still criminally responsible for the crime. And she's been fighting for that ever since. Vince Lee was committed to a high-security psychiatric ward for a year to be evaluated and treated for his schizophrenia. The anguish Tim's family went through doesn't really seem to equate what Vince's consequences were. Vince still brutally killed somebody, and Tim's family wants the law changed, so no other family has to go through what they went through. After that first year, Vince Lee would be transferred to a psychiatric center in Selkirk, Manitoba, until 2017. On June 3, 2010, Vince Lee was granted supervised outdoor walks within his mental health facility. On February 16, 2011, 2 passengers, Deborah Trucker of Port Colborne and Kaylee Law of London, Ontario, both filed lawsuits against Vince Lee Greyhound and the RCMP and the Government of Canada for being exposed to the horrific beheading. They were each seeking damages of $3 million in June of 2015. That lawsuit was officially dropped in 2012. Vince Lee was interviewed by Chris Somerville, CEO of the Schizophrenic Society of Canada in the Selkirk, Manitoba facility where Vince was living. Vince Lee signed an affidavit agreeing to the publication of the interview, and I'll link that interview down below. There's no videotape of it. It's just a transcript of the interview in total. Chris Somerville says that Vince lives every day with remorse for what he did, and apparently he's extremely embarrassed and ashamed. Vince also says that he's happy to be on medication, and apparently he's not hearing the voice of God anymore. He also says that he would be happy to be under a treatment order because he never wants to do anything like that ever again. I should hope not. He also promises to call his doctors if the voices ever return. I'm really struggling with that one because he wouldn't call doctors in the first place. Because he didn't believe in Western medicine, and now he's okay with Western medicine. I don't know. Something about that one bugs me. So while Vince Lee's health appears to be doing so much better, he seems to be the only one involved in this story. What about the mental health of the passengers? None of them lost a loved one that night, but they all lost a little bit of themselves. The lives that they had before that horrible night are gone forever. The passengers, the bus driver, and the police officers present that night have indicated in several interviews that since witnessing the events on bus 1170, they had suffered nightmares and other symptoms of PTSD, and many now have anxiety issues. They can't go into large crowds or ever take buses again. "I'm back there every day," says passenger Marlene Gregory. "It just doesn't go away." She was off to work in Winnipeg, 3 hours east. It was a trip that she used to make often, but she hasn't made it since. Stephen Allison, age 18 at the time of the killing, was sitting directly across from Vince Lee within arm's reach. "Since that day, it's been hard to go out and hard to meet new people. I'm always suspicious everywhere I go that someone will do something. I'm always looking over my back, even around friends." He almost failed at a university, and even though Greyhound promised to pay for trauma counseling, the email addresses and phone numbers Greyhound provided suddenly stopped working. Coincidentally enough, The company reimbursed him and his wife $437 for clothing, trading cards, a pillow, and a pair of sunglasses. The belongings were apparently so stained that they couldn't give them back to the passengers. The bus driver, Bruce Martin, who pleaded with Vince Lee to stop stabbing Tim McLean, often relives the moment 5 to 50 times a day. He can no longer work and relies heavily on his wife, according to a statement his lawyer read at the hearing. And the RCMP officer who first boarded the bus never recovered. The visions of what happened that day wouldn't leave him, and 6 years later, he sadly took his own life. Chris Edgar, the truck driver who stopped to help, unfortunately saw a lot of what happened on the bus as well, because he was so close to the bus, standing there with the barricade to the door. He suffers from PTSD, and there isn't a day that goes by that he doesn't mourn. Tim McLean, sadly, Chris' PTSD pushed him into alcoholism. The drinking started just to help him sleep at night, but the nightmares wouldn't stop, so his drinking would get worse and worse. Another passenger who gave birth years later had her newborn taken away by social workers. But because they were concerned, her mental illness, which stems from PTSD on that day, would make her unfit to care for her own child. Her child stayed in foster care for 18 months before custody was given to the child's grandmother. This passenger has nightmares, trouble sleeping, can't use public transit, and has problems trusting people. She's on medication, and it is not known if she'll ever recover. So Canada's justice system is very much about rehabilitation, and that's not always a bad thing when dealing with nonviolent crimes. But when it comes to violent crimes, that's another story. The question of Vince Lee's accountability will always remain an issue. Vince was apparently a model patient and was cooperative in the mental health center, and by 2010, he would be given outside privileges and would be allowed. Visitors and health professionals say he understands his mistakes and just wants to live a normal life. The following year, in 2011, the doctors would give him more privileges because he was responding so well to treatment. In 2012, Vince Lee was allowed temporary passes. That meant he could go into the town of Selkirk, Manitoba, but he was supervised by a nurse or a peace officer. He responded well to these outings, and in 2014, Vince would be allowed to go unsupervised into town, starting with just 30 minutes, but would increase to full-day trips. In 2016, Vince would change his name to Will Bay Acre before being fully released in 2017 with an absolute discharge. The courts have said now that he doesn't pose a significant risk to the public. In February 2017, Global News reported that Vince Lee had been granted a full discharge from Selkirk, where he had been receiving treatment. Vince Lee, who now goes by Will Baker, was granted a full discharge Friday afternoon. Baker was found NCR for killing Tim McLean on a Greyhound bus in 2008. Because Baker was found NCR, he was eligible to apply for an absolute discharge, which he was granted Friday afternoon. According to a report from Manitoba's Criminal Code Review Board, this means he's no longer subject to any conditions. While reading older newspaper articles on this case, it was clear that Tim McLean's family and the passengers that day never thought that Vince would get an absolute discharge. The lawyer for the McLean family was also sure this would never happen and knew that it would cause tremendous psychological harm to the family. Carol, Tim's mother, would say that the trauma Tim's family has gone through and the other passengers went through wasn't taken into consideration, and she was sick to her stomach when she found out about his freedom. In an interview she did with Global Morning, she said she was concerned about the safety of the public because there is no legal requirement in Canada for this extremely mentally ill individual to treat his illness. She said there has been no justice for her son. She also says that schizophrenia is a lifelong and incurable illness. And the psychiatric community says that they cannot predict the future behavior of any individual. Why are they predicting he is going to take his medicine? And because he's received an absolute discharge, this means he has absolutely no criminal record. There's nothing in the books that shows that he killed Tim. He has every freedom that every other Canadian has. He can cross the border, and that diagnosis won't follow him. So from what I could find, Will Baker has kept out of trouble since he was released in 2017. Back in 2017, it was said he was going to get post-secondary training, and he wanted to get a career and stay in Manitoba. The doctors seem confident that he's going to stay on his medication, and that he understands he has to continue taking his medication in order to live a reasonable and responsible life. On the 11th anniversary of Tim McLean's death, his mother visited the roadside memorial just outside Portage la Prairie. She expressed her feelings on Facebook in a post accompanied by photos of the white cross and flowers that remain on the spot where her son died. She wrote, "I was there today to visit you, that place where you drew your last breath. I left some flowers and filled the water jugs for others who stopped and visited. I know they'll water them if it's needed. I'm grateful for the individual who cuts the grass there each year. A big thank you to Ken Bosch Greenhouse for the tree they donated years ago that is doing so well amongst the lilacs. We miss you, Timothy. Your smile and laughter. I think the whole country is still in a state of disbelief over the ridiculousness of NCR. Your precious life was worth so much more." McLean Sr. and his family also filed a lawsuit of $150,000 against Lee Greyhound and the Attorney General of Canada. "Our lawsuit right now is still in limbo. Greyhound does not want to back down on anything, I guess because they're company and they figure they can do that. We don't believe it's right. Right. From day one, we've received condolences and thank yous and so sorries from everybody from Transport Canada, from the RCMP, from the media. Everybody except Greyhound acknowledged their condolences. And to this day, Greyhound still has not acknowledged any condolences or anything done right by our son. Greyhound even kept the bus Tim died on in service, a fact that his friends and family did not like. However, this is no longer an issue. In a May 14, 2021 article on autoweek.com, it said that after almost a century of operations, Greyhound Canada has shut down permanently in the country. Last night at midnight, 1 year after COVID-19 took a toll on its already precarious business, Greyhound's closure has left many careless people from remote areas throughout Canada's west without a reliable means of transportation. And many are resorting once again to the dangerous practice of hitchhiking to get from place to place. So I was a little nervous to cover this case. No matter what my overall opinions or thoughts are, I'm going to make somebody angry. Many Canadians and others who have taken an interest in this case have strong feelings and a variety of opinions regarding its outcome, myself included. I think most people can tell that I wasn't very happy with how things ended. And there are many questions about why Vince Lee wasn't kept in a psychiatric facility indefinitely. And the problem lies with a little-known Supreme Court of Canada ruling. In 1999, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that people found not criminally responsible for their crimes must be given an absolute discharge without restrictions or conditions if they no longer pose a significant threat to the public. And since a psychiatrist at the Selkirk Mental Health Center near Winnipeg set the wheels in motion, by testifying that Lee had a 0.8 chance of reoffending, the government really didn't have much of a choice. They had to let him go. I'm not sure how the psychiatrist came up with those odds, but quite honestly, 1% is still too high for me. This man is a cannibal killer who beheaded his victim in the back of a Greyhound bus, cut out his heart, and ate a piece of it. Time doesn't erase those facts. I am all for destigmatizing mental illness, but I find it difficult to believe that Vince Lee is a miracle of forensic psychiatry and has almost a 0 chance of reoffending. What really needs to happen is the law in Canada needs to be changed so someone can be found mentally ill but still criminally responsible. But the politicians don't seem to want to get involved because it's a bit of a hot topic issue. However, they can't keep ignoring it forever. According to an April 5, 2021 article in the National Post, NCR cases are on the rise, although most aren't high-profile murder cases. In a 2015 study, which is one of the few detailed analyses of NCR cases in Canada, it was found that 1.7 criminal cases in every 1,000 ended with an NCR verdict in Ontario, 9.27 in 1,000 in Quebec, and 0.8 in 1,000 in British Columbia. Tim McLean's family and many others fear that Vince Lee will stop taking his medication, which is a reality. There's nothing on the books that's forcing him to take his medication. He is as free as anyone else. There are some people who are on medication for mental illness that when they're feeling great, they stop taking their pills because they feel good and they think they don't need them anymore. I was one of those people, and I still am one of those people who was not happy with the NCR verdict. I don't know what the solutions are, though. I just know that everything about this case feels wrong. But 6 years in a mental health facility, and now he's out living his life? It just doesn't sit right with me. He killed a man. He decapitated that person, and he traumatized everyone who witnessed it. I'm happy his mental health is better, but what about everyone else's? Treatment for mental illness also isn't going to be consistent every single day. He's going to have good days and bad days. And having an absolute discharge means the rest of us have to cross our fingers and hope that he does what he says he's going to do and sees his doctor if he relapses. So now that you know what I think, I'm curious to know your thoughts. What are your thoughts about Canada's NCR laws? If you love chilling true crime mysteries, unsolved disappearances, and cases that defy logic, then hit like, drop a comment with your theories, and subscribe to Dark Truths Uncovered, true crime stories that will keep you up at night. See you in the next one.